My voice didn't crack when I told him to get out of my house. That surprised me. Everything inside me was shaking, but my voice came out steady, almost quiet. I think that scared him more than if I'd yelled. Let me back up. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a family court mediator in Raleigh, North Carolina. I've sat across from people on the worst days of their lives. Mothers who hadn't slept in weeks. Fathers gripping their knees to keep from crying. Children who learned too young that love could hurt. I've heard things in that job that most people will never hear, and I genuinely believed that experience had made me sharp. Perceptive, the kind of man who could read a room. I was wrong about that. It took my own daughter to teach me how wrong. Her name is Lydia. She's 31 now, but when she married Nathan Greer, she was 28 and the happiest I'd ever seen her. He was 33, worked in commercial real estate, drove a clean truck, shook my hand firmly the first time we met. Her mother, my wife, Sandra, liked him immediately. Sandra has always been a better judge of character than me in social situations. The irony of that still stings. The wedding was in October, 2 years before everything fell apart. Small ceremony, maybe 80 people, out at a venue near Lake Wheeler. Lydia wore her grandmother's earrings. She laughed all the way through the vows. I cried, which I hadn't expected to do, and Nathan's mother, a woman named Roberta, patted my arm and said, "She's got a good one." I thanked her and meant it. Roberta. I need to tell you about Roberta. She was 61, recently widowed, lived about 40 minutes away in Garner. She called Nathan every single day, sometimes twice. He always answered. I noticed that early on, but told myself it was nothing. She'd just lost her husband, she was lonely. What kind of son doesn't check on his grieving mother? I told myself that story for almost 2 years. The first sign I missed came about 4 months into the marriage. Lydia mentioned, almost in passing, that Nathan had asked her to stop going to her Thursday night book club. Said the group had a negative energy and he didn't like how she came home afterward. Lydia laughed when she told me like it was a funny quirk. I laughed too. I don't know what I was thinking. In my job, that would have been a flag the size of a barn door. The second sign came when she stopped calling her college roommate. They'd been friends for 9 years. Lydia told me they'd drifted apart. I accepted that. People do drift apart. The third sign, and I'm almost ashamed to say how long it took me to add these things up, was her job. Lydia had worked as a licensed physical therapist at an outpatient clinic in Cary. She was good at it. She cared about her patients in the way that can't be faked. About 14 months after the wedding, she gave her notice. She told me and Sandra that she wanted to focus on building a home, maybe start a family. She seemed fine when she said it. Calm. Sandra squeezed her hand and said that sounded wonderful. I asked Nathan about it once, privately. He said the hours had been hard on her and she'd made the choice herself. He said it with a small smile that I now understand was meant to close the conversation. It worked. Here's what a family court mediator knows and what a father forgets. The signs of control don't announce themselves. They're quiet. Each one alone looks like nothing. A reasonable decision, a personality quirk, a shift in priorities. It's only when you lay them side by side that the picture forms, and by then you've already told yourself 100 times that you were wrong to worry. I started to worry around month 18 of their marriage. Lydia seemed smaller somehow. Not physically, she looked fine, but she'd gotten quieter. She used to challenge me in conversations, push back on my opinions, laugh loudly at her own jokes. The woman sitting across from me at family dinners answered questions with short sentences and glanced at Nathan before she answered anything complicated. I brought it up with Sandra one night. Sandra said I was projecting. She said Lydia was an adult woman in a marriage, and not every quiet spell meant something was wrong. I heard her. I told myself she was right. I went to sleep. The dinner that changed everything happened on a Sunday in late November. Sandra and I had driven out to their house in Apex. They'd bought a place there 2 years in, 4-bedroom colonial. Nathan's parents had helped with the down payment. Roberta liked to remind us of that. Roberta was there when we arrived. She'd apparently stopped by earlier in the day and stayed. That happened a lot. We sat down around 6. Sandra had brought a sweet potato casserole. Lydia had made roast chicken. The table looked nice. I remember thinking it looked nice. Nathan was in a mood. I could tell immediately that particular stillness that some people get when they're controlling something under the surface. He'd been short with Lydia in the kitchen while we were all getting settled, and she'd moved around him carefully, the way you move around something you've learned not to bump into. About 20 minutes into the meal, Lydia reached across the table for the breadbasket and knocked over a glass of water. It wasn't dramatic. The glass didn't break. Water spread across the tablecloth, hit the edge of Nathan's plate, and that was it. What happened next took maybe 8 seconds. Nathan set down his fork. He looked at Lydia, and then he said very quietly, "Are you serious right now?" She started to get up to grab a towel. He grabbed her wrist, not hard enough to leave a mark, but hard enough to stop her. "I'm talking to you," he said. She said she was sorry. He said she was always sorry, and then he said something I can't repeat here, directly to her face, about what kind of woman she was. She didn't cry. She just sat there. And that stillness, that practiced, learned stillness, told me everything I'd been refusing to see for 2 years. I put my napkin on the table. Roberta, from her end of the table, said, "Lydia, maybe next time you'll be more careful." Said it the way you'd remind a child to tie their shoes. Calm. Almost kind. Like what just happened was reasonable. Like it was instructive. Sandra had gone white. I could see her hand on the tablecloth. I said Nathan's name. He looked at me. There was nothing apologetic in his face. If anything, he looked slightly inconvenienced. The way you look when someone interrupts a conversation you were already done having. I said, "You don't speak to my daughter that way." He said, "Gil, stay out of this." That's my name, Gil Mercer. And in 31 years of sitting in rooms with people in crisis, no one has ever told me to stay out of it with quite that tone. Like I was an annoyance, like I had no standing in the room where my daughter was sitting with water on the tablecloth and humiliation on her face. I looked at Lydia. She was looking at her plate. She said very quietly, "Dad, it's fine." It was the saddest 3 words I've ever heard. I stood up. I told Nathan and Roberta that we were leaving. I asked Lydia to get her coat. Nathan laughed, actually laughed, and said Lydia wasn't going anywhere. Roberta folded her hands and watched. Here's something they didn't know about me. I spent 3 years before my mediation career as a paralegal, and in 31 years of family court, I'd referred more domestic cases to more attorneys and social workers than most people see in a lifetime. I knew exactly who to call. I walked out to my car. Sandra followed. I could hear Nathan's voice through the closed front door, low and controlled, telling Lydia to see us out. She came to the door. I hugged her in the doorway. I could feel how rigid she was, how careful. I said quietly into her hair, "You do not have to stay." She said, "I'm okay." I said, "I know you think that." And then I let go and walked to the car. I didn't call the police that night. I want to be honest about that. Because I made a decision, and I want to explain it. What I'd witnessed that night. His words, his grip on her wrist, Roberta's enabling. That was real, and it was serious. But I knew from 31 years of experience that a single incident report, without more, often does very little in the short term, except alert the abuser to be more careful. I'd seen that cycle so many times in my career that I knew what it produced. I wasn't going to fire one shot and miss. I called my daughter the next morning. She said everything was fine. She sounded like someone reading from a script they'd memorized. I called a colleague of mine, a woman named Dr. Alicia Webb, a licensed clinical social worker I'd worked with for 15 years. I told her what I'd seen. She asked me several questions. At the end, she said what I already knew. What I described was a pattern consistent with coercive control, and the escalation from verbal to physical in front of witnesses was significant. She also said gently, "Gil, how long has this been going on?" I didn't answer for a moment. And then I said, "I think 2 years." And she said, "That's what I'd guess too." Over the next 6 weeks, I documented everything I could remember, with dates and context: the book club, the job, her friend, the way she'd stopped visiting without him. I reached out quietly to Lydia's old supervisor at the PT clinic, who told me, with some hesitation, because she's a good person, that Lydia had mentioned pressure at home when she'd resigned. I wrote it down. I reached out to two people at my church who'd had Nathan and Lydia over to dinner the previous year. One of them, a retired teacher named Frances, said she'd felt something was off, but hadn't wanted to say anything. I wrote that down too. Then, 3 weeks after that dinner, Lydia called me on a Tuesday afternoon. She was crying. Not the performative crying of someone who wants comfort, the flat, exhausted crying of someone who's been holding something for too long. She said Nathan had pushed her the night before when she'd come home late from a grocery run. She said it wasn't the first time. I asked her one question: "Do you want out?" She said yes. I said, "Okay, don't tell him, don't change anything. I'm going to handle this." I called Dr. Webb. I called a domestic violence attorney I'd worked alongside for years, a man named Stephen Calloway out of Durham. I called the non-emergency line for the Wake County Sheriff's Office and asked to speak with someone in the family violence unit. I had documentation. I had a willing victim. I had a witness. Sandra had seen what happened at that dinner, and she was ready to say so. What followed was not fast. I want to be clear about that, because the truth of these situations is that the process is slow, and it requires patience, and it is genuinely hard. Nathan was served with an emergency domestic violence protective order on a Thursday morning. Lydia was at our house by Thursday afternoon, with 2 bags, her laptop, and her cat. Nathan called me 4 times that day. I didn't answer. He left a message on the 3rd call that I saved and later provided to Stephen, because in it he said things that significantly helped Lydia's case. Roberta called Sandra. Sandra, who had been raised to be polite in all situations, answered the phone, listened to about 30 seconds of Roberta explaining that her son was being persecuted, and then said, "Roberta, your son put his hands on my daughter. We are done talking." And she hung up. I've never been prouder of her. The protective order was followed by divorce proceedings. Nathan hired an attorney and contested everything. That's their right, and it was expected. What he didn't account for was the documentation. The text Lydia had quietly started saving after our phone call on that Tuesday, the records from the PT clinic, the timeline I'd built, and a statement from Frances. Stephen said the file was unusually thorough for a case that had never been formally reported before. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. Lydia got the house in Apex. Nathan's attorney had argued hard against it, but the protective order history and documented coercive control changed the calculation. She got a fair division of the assets. She did not get back the 2 years she spent making herself smaller to survive inside that marriage. And that's something I still sit with. Nathan, as far as I know, still lives in the area. I occasionally hear his name. I don't react to it. There's nothing left to react to. Roberta never apologized. I don't expect she will. Some people build their whole identity around the belief that their child can do no wrong, and apologizing would require dismantling something they've spent a lifetime constructing. I pity her in the abstract, but I don't think about her much. What I think about is this: I spent 3 decades in a career built around recognizing exactly what happened in my daughter's marriage. I read papers on coercive control. I testified as an expert. I referred families to resources. And I still sat at Sunday dinners and told myself the quiet was nothing. The resignation was her choice. The drift from her friends was just what happened when you got married. I think about the family court mediator in me who knew, and the father in me who didn't want to. Lydia is back at work now, at a new clinic in Raleigh. She went back to her book club. She and her old roommate have been talking again. They met for coffee last spring and called me afterward, both of them laughing about something I don't fully understand, and the sound of Lydia laughing like that, unself-consciously, freely, that was the moment I felt like I could exhale. She asked me once, a few months after the divorce was final, why I hadn't pushed harder earlier. Why I'd waited until that dinner. I told her the truth. I said I hadn't wanted to see it, that I'd told myself I didn't have enough evidence, that she was an adult and it wasn't my place, that I could be wrong. All the things I had watched other fathers tell themselves in the rooms I'd sat in for 30 years. I said I was sorry it took me as long as it did. She said, "You came, though." I've been thinking about that ever since. You came, though. Not you were perfect. Not you were fast enough. Not you got everything right. Just you came. If there's someone in your life right now who seems a little quieter than they used to be, who seems to be making a series of small, reasonable decisions that all point in the same direction, away from their friends, away from their work, away from the things that used to make them light up, I'm asking you to trust that feeling. Don't do what I did. Don't wait for the dinner. Ask the question. Be ready for them to say everything is fine. Ask again. And when they're ready to say yes, be the person who already knows what to do next. I keep coming back to that moment at the table when Lydia said, "Dad, it's fine." Not because it was the worst moment of that night, it wasn't, but because of how she said it, flat, rehearsed, like she'd said it to herself so many times it had stopped meaning anything. That's what control does to a person. It doesn't break them all at once. It teaches them, slowly, to shrink the perimeter of what they're willing to call a problem. A canceled book club becomes nothing. A resigned job becomes a choice. A grip on the wrist becomes fine. By the time someone says "I'm okay" in that particular tone, they've usually spent months reclassifying things that were never okay to begin with. I spent 31 years helping families in crisis, and I still did that. I still told myself I could be wrong. The lesson I had to sit with, the one I genuinely didn't want to learn, is that caring about someone is not the same as seeing them clearly. Love can make you generous in ways that cost the other person. I was generous with my assumptions about Nathan for 2 years, and Lydia paid for that. What I understand now is that the ability to see clearly, to hold what you know against what you want to believe, and choose the truth, that's not a personality trait you either have or don't. It's a discipline. It requires you to ask harder questions and feel comfortable, to sit with answers that inconvenience you, to act on what you know, even when the person you love is telling you not to. I had the knowledge. I was missing the honesty to use it on myself. And then there's what came after the dinner. The documentation, the calls, the months of careful, deliberate work before anything moved. People sometimes imagine justice as a single decisive moment. It rarely is. What actually changed Lydia's situation was not one dramatic scene. It was patience, preparation, and the willingness to keep going even when the process was slow and uncertain. And Nathan's attorney was doing everything he could to stall it. That kind of persistence, the unglamorous, undramatic kind, is what actually holds. Anyone can be brave for 8 seconds. The harder thing is being steady for 8 months. What I want to say, if you're sitting with your own version of this, your own quiet dinner, your own string of small reasonable explanations, is that you already know. You don't need more evidence. You need the courage to stop negotiating with what you're seeing. The moment Lydia said, "You came, though," that is what I think about when I wonder whether any of it mattered. Not the legal outcome, not the protective order, not the finalized decree. Just that. You came. That's the only thing I want to be remembered for in this. Not that I was smart enough to build a file. That I came when it counted, even if I was 2 years late. Don't be 2 years late.